The shed reeked of damp earth and danger. Caleb Hartley moved like a shadow between crates, his rifle steady, until the glint of a curved blade emerged from behind him. The attacker's footsteps were silent, his intent lethal. Outside, Mara Quinn froze, her breath caught, the weight of years of silence pressing down on her chest. Then as the blade arced toward Caleb's back, something inside her broke loose. She ran forward, her voice erupting in a raw, piercing scream. "Caleb!" The cry shattered the night, halting the killer for one heartbeat, just enough for Caleb to twist, strike, and fire. People said she was mute as stone, but that night, her voice not only saved his life, it changed both of theirs forever. The October air in Colorado territory was thin and cold, threading through the narrow gorge like a whisper too ashamed to speak aloud. Cottonwoods stood stripped and skeletal along the canyon floor, their dying leaves crackling under the boots of men who had come here for reasons best left unspoken. Oil lanterns swung from crooked poles, casting sickly halos over canvas tents patched with shadow. The smell was a thick, sour mix of whiskey, sweat, and greed. This was no ordinary market. It was a gathering of vultures in human skin. Caleb Hartley stood on the edge of the light, his hat brimmed low, arms folded beneath a dusty coat. He'd come to town for nothing more than a sack of salt and a handful of nails. He wasn't the type to linger in crowds, let alone in places that stank of desperation. But then he heard it, a sharp, muffled cry, cut short as though the sound itself had been strangled. The crowd shifted, parting just enough for him to see the source. A man dragged a young woman onto a makeshift wooden platform. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her wrists were bound tight with coarse rope, her mouth gagged with a strip of linen darkened by her own breath. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, streaked with dirt, and her arms were mottled with bruises. But it was her eyes, dark, defiant, and terrified, that stopped Caleb cold. "Name's Mara Quinn," the seller announced with a sneer, yanking her upright by one elbow. "Dumb as a post, doesn't speak a lick, strong enough for work, but not a tear in her. Can't cry, can't talk, can't love. Useless, really?" The crowd laughed. Someone near the front tossed out an offer. $2. Another voice mocked. "She ain't worth that much." The seller spat into the dirt. "5, and I'll be rid of her." Caleb stepped forward, his boots crunching against gravel, the movement alone silencing a few nearby. His voice, when it came, was low but carried like a shot across the hollow. "I'll give you 10. Heads turned. Even the horses tied to the post shifted uneasily. The seller blinked, caught off guard. "You serious?" Caleb didn't answer with words. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small coin pouch, and tossed it onto the platform. It landed with a solid thunk. The seller counted quickly, his fingers trembling now. "She's yours," he muttered, shoving Mara forward like she was nothing more than a broken crate. She stumbled. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground, his hands gentle as he removed the gag and cut the cords binding her wrists. She didn't thank him. She didn't run either. "Come," he said simply, tilting his head toward the trail leading out of the canyon. "You don't belong here." Mara hesitated, one foot back, eyes scanning the crowd as if expecting someone, anyone, to stop her. But no one did. And finally, like a leaf surrendering to the wind, she followed Caleb into the darkness, leaving the night market and her chains behind. The Boone Ranch sat quiet against the sweep of the Colorado hills, a place where the wind was louder than any human voice. Caleb Hartley led Mara Quinn through the main gate without a word. The horses in the corral lifted their heads as they passed, their breath misting in the crisp morning air. He didn't take her to the house. Instead, he opened the side door to the tack room beside the barn, a small space smelling of leather, hay, and cedar shavings. Inside, a narrow cot was pushed against the wall, a wool blanket folded neatly on top. "You'll sleep here," he said simply. "Nobody comes this way but me and the horses." Mara didn't reply, didn't even nod. She sat down on the cot, her shoulders drawn high as if bracing for a blow that never came. Caleb set a canteen on the table, along with a small plate of bread and a mug of hot broth. Then he left, closing the door without looking back. Over the next 2 days, he came and went with the same quiet efficiency. At dawn, a tin cup of fresh water appeared on her table. By midday, there was always something warm, stew, bread, or boiled potatoes. In the evening, another blanket for the dropping temperatures. He never lingered, never asked questions, and she never spoke. On the third morning, Caleb walked into the tack room and placed a small, worn notebook and a stub of pencil on the table beside her bed. On the top page, written in firm block letters, were 5 simple words: "Write what you cannot say." He left without explanation. That night, when he returned with a folded coat and a lantern, the notebook had been moved. A single page had been torn out and tucked beneath the corner of his toolbox. Caleb pulled it free, the faint smell of pencil lead clinging to the paper. In small, careful letters, she had written, "Horse safe. Thank you." He held the note for a long moment before slipping it into his breast pocket. It stayed there, close to his heart, for the rest of the week. To anyone else, it might have been nothing, just 3 plain words. But to Caleb Hartley, it was the first real thing Mara Quinn had ever said to him, and somehow it felt heavier, more valuable than gold. By the end of the first week, Caleb Hartley saddled his gentlest mare, a dapple gray beauty named June. When he led the horse to the barn door, Mara Quinn hesitated in the shadows, unsure if the invitation was real. Caleb didn't rush her. He rested a hand lightly on the saddle horn, palm open, and waited. Slowly she stepped forward. Without touching her skin, he guided her foot into the stirrup, letting her adjust the reins on her own. When she was ready, he mounted behind and nudged June into an easy walk. They followed the creek, where the water mirrored the pale blue sky, and then moved through a stand of aging cottonwoods, their bare branches creaking softly in the wind. Neither spoke, but in that shared silence something shifted. Back at the ranch, the notebook became their quiet bridge. Each morning, she would leave a page for him. "Cold today. Thank you for the soup. Fence is broken." Caleb's replies came in the form of action. The next day, the fence was patched. A fresh loaf of bread, still warm, appeared on her table. The water troughs were cleaned and filled before sunrise. She began to see his care not in words, but in the way he moved through the day. Steady, unhurried, dependable. One crisp morning, Mara stepped into the barn and found him kneeling beside June's saddle. With his pocket knife, he was carving something into the leather strap that held the stirrup. She stayed back, watching the way his hands worked, slow, deliberate, as though each cut mattered. When he finished, he stood, brushing the leather clean. He didn't show her his work. He just set the saddle in its place and left. Later, when she came to tend June, Mara saw it. Her name, Mara, etched deep into the leather, the edges darkened with fresh oil. She ran her fingertips over the letters, her breath catching. That day, without deciding, she began to do more. She fed the chickens, hauled small buckets of water from the well, patched holes in the barn walls with old blankets and nails. She didn't announce it. She didn't look for his praise. But Caleb noticed, and for the first time, the ranch didn't feel like a place she was passing through. It began to feel like a place where she belonged. It was well past midnight when Caleb Hartley felt a light touch on his shoulder. His eyes opened instantly, meeting Mara Quinn's pale face in the dim glow of the dying hearth. She didn't speak, only motioned for him to follow. Barefoot, she led him through the back room to the kitchen. The boards beneath their feet creaked in the quiet, every sound magnified in the stillness. At the far corner, she knelt beside the stove and pried up a warped plank in the floor. The scent of cold earth and dust rose up from the hollow beneath. From the darkness, she pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle and set it between them on the worn kitchen table. Caleb loosened the ties, revealing a stack of yellowed papers and a folded map, edges frayed from years of handling. He scanned the top sheet, dozens of first names written in shaky ink. Beside each were dates and strange symbols, some that looked like coordinates, others like coded marks. Turning to the map, he saw hand-drawn routes snaking from Colorado south into New Mexico. Several points were circled: remote canyons, shacks, places no ordinary traveler would ever notice. At the bottom corner was a name he recognized, though he wished he didn't: Silas Ward. Beside it was a ring-shaped burn mark, a smuggler's brand. Caleb's jaw tightened. Mara reached for her notebook, flipping to a fresh page. She wrote with quick, forceful strokes, her hand trembling. When she pushed it toward him, the words were simple but heavy. "He sells girls. They're still alive." She pointed to one of the names on the list, then to herself, her eyes locked on his, unblinking. She wrote again, "Help them." For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. The papers between them seemed to pulse with the weight of every life they represented. He thought of the other girls, nameless to the world, bound and sold like cattle, girls who had no one to speak for them. Finally, he folded the map and tucked it back into the bundle. His voice was low, steady. "All right." It wasn't a promise made for her alone. It was for every name inked on that page. And Mara knew, in that moment, she no longer carried this burden alone. The map led them to a desolate stretch of land where the moonlight pooled in patches between skeletal cottonwoods. At the edge of an overgrown cemetery stood a crumbling stone shed, half sunken into the hillside. The air smelled of rust and damp earth, perfect cover for the kind of business that thrived in shadows. Caleb Hartley crouched behind a rusted gate, his eyes scanning the clearing. Beside him, Mara Quinn clutched the old riding coat he had given her, its heavy wool swallowing her slight frame. She pointed toward the shed. A faint flicker of lamplight bled through a crack in the warped door. "Stay here," he whispered. She didn't nod, but she didn't move either. Caleb slipped into the darkness, his boots silent on the brittle grass. Inside, the shed was worse than he expected. Ropes hung from nails in the wall, cages sat open but stained, and in the corner lay a ledger damp with some unidentifiable dark spill. As he turned a page, a shift of gravel behind him was his only warning. The blow came fast, a rifle stock slamming into his shoulder, spinning him toward another man with a curved blade glinting in the moonlight. Caleb ducked and drew his weapon, but the second attacker closed in from behind. From the tree line, Mara saw it all. The way the knife's arc was about to meet Caleb's back. Something inside her, locked away for years, snapped free. Her lungs filled, and before she could think, she screamed. "Caleb!" The name tore through the night like a gunshot, halting the attacker for a heartbeat. Caleb spun, driving his elbow into the man's throat, then fired. The echo cracked across the canyon. The knife clattered to the dirt. Caleb staggered back, eyes wide, not from the fight, but from the sound of her voice. Mara stood frozen at the shed's edge, her hand over her mouth, trembling. They didn't speak as they left, the moonlight trailing them like a watchful eye. But something had changed, irreversibly. Mara Quinn had a voice again, even if it came in ragged bursts. And now that it had broken the surface, she wasn't going to let it sink back into silence. The morning after the shed fight, Caleb Hartley rode hard for the edge of Three Pines, where the telegraph station doubled as a storeroom for the man he needed, Jedediah "Jed" Cole. Once, Jed had worn the sheriff's badge with pride. Now he swept dust from the station floor, the badge tucked away in a drawer, stripped from him after he'd accused powerful ranchers of trafficking girls across the territory. When Caleb walked in and set a folded map and a damp, stained ledger on the counter, Jed's broom stilled. His eyes scanned the names, the coordinates, the burn mark of a smuggler's brand. His jaw hardened. "You bring hell to my door, Hartley," Jed said. "I brought you proof," Caleb replied, "and 3 girls who are still breathing because of it." Jed shut the station door, turned the lock, and pulled the faded badge from the drawer. "Then let's finish this." Over the next 2 nights, the plan took shape. The traffickers' camp was set up behind the old mill barn on the riverbank. Buyers were expected at dawn. Caleb would ride in first, posing as a trader with fresh supplies. Jed and 2 deputies, men still loyal to him, would flank the camp from the ridge. Mara Quinn's role was the quietest, but in many ways the most dangerous. Before sunrise, she would slip into the abandoned church across from the mill. In the bell tower, she'd unfurl a sign she had painted the night before in thick black strokes. "Girls inside, help." Once the sign was in place, she'd ring the bell, long and low, so the sound carried across the river and into the town. That was the signal. On the night before the raid, the 3 of them sat at a rough pine table, the air smelling faintly of coffee and gun oil. Caleb checked the rifle slung across his back. Jed unrolled a coil of rope. Mara folded the sign carefully, tucking it into her satchel. No one spoke of what would happen if the plan failed. They didn't have to. In their eyes, the truth was plain. There would be no second chance. When dawn came, the sound of church bells would mean war. Dawn broke pale and cold over the riverbank, mist curling around the skeletal frame of the old mill barn. Caleb Hartley rode in slow, a bundle of burlap-wrapped goods slung over his saddle, his hat brimmed low to shadow his face. Two guards lounged by the gate, their rifles cradled lazily. One squinted, then waved him through without much thought. Traders came and went in this business. Inside, the barn smelled of hay, sweat, and fear. Caleb counted 6 men, 2 with rifles, 3 loading crates, and 1 leaning against the far wall, chewing a toothpick like the world owed him something. Silas Ward. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, nodding to a man who stepped forward to inspect his goods. Then, just faintly, came the long, low toll of the church bell. From the ridgeline, Jed Cole and 2 deputies charged down, rifles spitting fire. Shouts erupted. One guard dropped instantly, another scrambled for cover. Caleb kicked a crate toward the nearest man, using it as a shield as he drew his revolver. A bullet grazed his shoulder, burning hot through the flesh, but he didn't slow. Gunfire rattled the air. Jed's men cut through the barn doors, driving the traffickers back toward the center. Caleb moved with them, his eyes locked on Silas, who had drawn his pistol and was sighting down the barrel. Then Mara Quinn appeared. She stepped from the shadows, her frame small but unshakable, positioning herself squarely between Silas and Caleb. Her eyes burned with a steady fire, and though her lips didn't part, the silence around her was louder than any scream. Silas hesitated, just long enough. Jed came in from the side, grabbing Silas's gun arm and twisting it hard until the weapon clattered to the ground. He slammed the man face first against a support beam and snapped iron cuffs around his wrists. Outside, townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the bell and the gunfire. They watched as Jed hauled Silas into the open, the once feared trafficker now shackled and beaten. No one cheered, but in the hush that followed, the weight of the moment settled in. Mara stood beside Caleb, her chin lifted, her gaze unflinching. She had faced the man who'd stolen her voice, and taken it back without saying a word. In the weeks after the raid, the town of Three Pines began to change in ways that couldn't be measured in noise or spectacle. No one forgot how the bell had rung that morning, or how Mara Quinn had stood her ground against Silas Ward without flinching. People who once looked at her with suspicion now greeted her with quiet nods. Some left small offerings on the porch of the ranch she shared with Caleb Hartley. A jar of honey, a loaf of fresh bread, a neatly folded quilt. No signatures, no fuss. Just gestures that spoke louder than words. Mara accepted each gift with the same gentle grace, never making a scene, never expecting more than what was freely given. By early spring, she had found her own place in the rhythm of the town. On sunny afternoons, she gathered a small circle of children in the yard outside the ranch house. There was no formal sign announcing her work, but word spread quickly. Mara Quinn was teaching letters. She spoke little, letting her pencil do most of the talking on the slate boards the children held in their laps. When a child struggled, she would kneel beside them, guiding their hand with patience that never seemed to fray. Parents began lingering at the fence, watching their children trace out words under Mara's quiet instruction. They started to understand that silence could be its own kind of language, a language of focus, of care, of listening. Over time, the ranch became more than just Caleb's place. It was Mara's place, a safe ground where voices, whether loud or soft, were heard. And for the first time, the town didn't just see her, they listened. The bullet had been sitting in a small tin on Caleb Hartley's workbench for months, a flattened piece of lead that had once been aimed to kill him, stopped only by a twist of fate in Mara Quinn's voice. One evening, after the day's chores were done and the sun was melting into the hills, Caleb sat at the forge behind the barn. He heated the bullet until it glowed, then hammered it gently, shaping the metal into something entirely new. Hour by hour, it became a simple band, unpolished, imperfect, but forged with purpose. The next morning, Mara found it on the kitchen table, resting on a folded square of linen. There was no note, no elaborate speech, just the ring, waiting. When she stepped outside, Caleb was by the corral, brushing down June. She walked up, the ring cupped in her palm. He glanced at it, then at her, and asked only one question. "Will you marry me here under the flowers you planted?" Her answer was a small nod, but the smile that followed was enough to make the air feel warmer. They went on a quiet afternoon beneath the old willow by the creek, the same spot where, long ago, Mara had left her first written words for him: "Horse safe. Thank you." There was no preacher, no formal ceremony. A neighbor played a slow tune on a weathered guitar. Mason jars filled with daisies sat on a plank table beside loaves of bread and steaming bowls of soup. Friends and townsfolk passed food and laughter in equal measure. When it came time, Mara didn't wait to be given away. She walked to Caleb, her hand steady in his, her eyes never leaving his. Caleb leaned down, his forehead brushing hers, and whispered, "You were never silent, Mara. You were just waiting for someone who'd listen." Under the willow's swaying branches, with the creek singing quietly behind them, they sealed their vows not with grand words, but with the shared knowledge that their home wasn't built from wood or stone. It was built from trust, patience, and the kind of love that grows stronger in the spaces between words. A year later, the ranch looked different, not in its bones, but in its heart. Wildflowers grew thick along the fence line, splashing the yard with colors that shifted with the seasons. The willow by the creek was fuller, its branches heavy with green, shading the spot where vows had once been whispered. Inside the house, laughter had returned, small and bright, belonging to a brown-haired little girl with eyes like her mother's. She chased chickens through the yard and clutched a tiny leather-bound notebook, a gift from Mara Quinn, though she wasn't yet old enough to write. She carried it as if it already held her whole world. In the evenings, Mara sat on the porch swing with their daughter curled in her lap, humming a lullaby so soft it felt like part of the wind. Caleb Hartley sat beside them, boots resting on the porch rail, one arm draped across the back of the swing. They didn't speak much about the past. There was no need. One crisp spring morning, Caleb pulled out his pocket knife and knelt at the front door. He worked slowly, carefully, the same way he had forged her ring. When he finished, the rough letters stood deep in the wood, a message meant for no one but them. Here she sang, and I listened. It wasn't about music, not really. It was about every moment when Mara's voice, whether spoken, written, or silent, had filled their lives. It was about the years she had been unheard, and the home they had built where she never would be again. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of flowers from the yard. Mara glanced at the carving, then at Caleb, and smiled. This was more than peace. This was home. Some stories from the Old West stay locked in history. Others, like Caleb and Mara's, feel just as alive today as they did under the wide frontier sky. In a world where voices can be drowned out by noise, this tale reminds us that listening, truly listening, can change someone's life. Patience, steady kindness, and quiet strength still have the power to heal wounds words can't reach. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is speak, or finally choose to be heard. In modern America, trust and community are still built one small act at a time. It might be a neighbor checking in, a teacher who refuses to give up on a struggling student, or a friend who sits beside you in silence because they know that's what you need. The heart of the West, resilience, loyalty, and compassion never really left us. But stories like this also leave us with questions worth talking about. Would you have risked your safety, as Caleb did, for someone you barely knew? If you'd been in Mara's place, would you have found your voice sooner or waited for the right moment? And what do you think happened to the other girls on that list? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your stories and perspectives make these tales richer and keep the spirit of the frontier alive. Thank you for spending time with us here on The West That Never Left. If this story stirred something in you, please give it a like, share it with someone who loves a good Western, and subscribe so you don't miss the next ride. Out here, the West may have changed, but its heart still beats.